I imagined my life could take such a drastic turn over something as trivial as a free upgrade. Just a week ago, I was excitedly packing for the family vacation my dad had planned to Hawaii to celebrate his retirement. Being able to bring my husband Mark and our 2 kids, Lily and Jaden, meant the world to me after years of hard work and sacrifice. The flight from Chicago was supposed to be the start of an amazing trip, a chance for us all to reconnect as a family. My older brother Thomas had also been looking forward to it, probably more than anyone else. At 6 feet 4 inches, he always struggled with cramped airplane seats, so I knew the long journey would be especially grueling for him. When we arrived at the gate, I could sense Thomas's relief as the gate agent announced they had a couple of first-class seats available due to no-shows. Given my airline status, I fully expected them to offer me one of those luxurious seats. A 12-hour flight in premium class would be a total treat. But what happened next caught me completely off guard. The gate agent approached me discreetly and said, "Mrs. Davis, we have a situation. There's one first-class seat available, and I'm afraid I'll have to give it to your brother Thomas due to his substantial height. Regulations mandate we accommodate passengers of his stature in our premium cabins whenever possible." I was dumbfounded. How could they bypass me, a top-tier frequent flyer, for my brother, who didn't even have status? Thomas looked equally stunned but quickly composed himself, flashing me an apologetic smile as he gathered his things to move to first class. Mark could sense my disbelief and tried to calm me down. "Honey, it's okay. At least one of you gets to fly comfortably. We're all going to the same place, right?" His rationalization did little to appease me. As we settled into our cramped seats in economy, I kept glancing towards the first-class curtain, my irritation growing. It felt like such an injustice, a blatant disregard for my loyalty to the airline over the years. Didn't my status count for anything? The flight grew increasingly miserable as my kids bickered incessantly. Riled up by the long journey, Jaden kept kicking the seat in front of him, much to the annoyance of our neighbors. Mark's feeble attempts to keep them settled only made me resent him more for dismissing my frustration so easily. Meanwhile, I witnessed Thomas being tendered to with utmost luxury gourmet meals, plush bedding, attentive service. Something inside me snapped when I caught him sipping a glass of champagne, laughing heartily at some in-flight movie. How dared he relish in that privilege that was rightfully mine? By the time we landed in Honolulu, I was seething. The vacation had barely begun, but I knew it was irrevocably tainted. My resentment towards Thomas and the airline had metastasized into an anger that would consume me for the entire trip unless I found a way to make this right. To restore the balance of fairness and loyalty. The first few days in Hawaii were incredibly tense. I could barely look at Thomas without feeling that burning resentment all over again. My family didn't understand why I was being so cold and distant, despite Mark trying to explain my perspective. "She worked hard for her status. It's only fair she gets the perks." He tried convincing them, but they just waved it off as me being petty over a silly seat. Things came to a head during our outdoor luau feast. As traditionally dressed dancers swayed across the stage, I noticed Thomas recording them with his phone, clearly enjoying the prime view his multimedia-equipped first-class seat had afforded him. I seated thinking about all the amazing content he was capturing, while my dumpy economy seat left me craning my neck. "Everything okay, dear?" Mark asked, noticing my burning glare. Before I could respond, a chunk of poi went flying past my head, splattering across Thomas's phone and pristine first-class amenities kit. "Sarah! What the hell?" Thomas shouted, equal parts angry and bewildered as the dancer stopped abruptly. I turned to see Lily hastily trying to cover up her mischievous grin. In that moment, I felt a rush of vindication. My 6-year-old daughter had struck a tiny blow for me against the injustice of the airline system. "Lily, you apologize to your uncle right now," Mark scolded, horrified. But I couldn't bring myself to reprimand her. The next morning, Thomas was still stewing over the luau incident, shooting me accusatory looks over the breakfast buffet. I decided to take Jaden to the beach while Mark handled checkout, hoping some distance would diffuse the tension. But as I gathered our belongings later that afternoon, I realized Jaden's prized teddy bear was missing the one he's had since birth and refused to travel without. I knew he must have taken it to the beach, which sent my mind spiraling over where it could have ended up. My fears were confirmed when I glanced out the window and saw a brown plush figure bobbing up and down in the powerful tide. "Jaden. Oh my God, you're Bear," I cried out, my heart dropping into my stomach. Without a second thought, I flung open the balcony door and raced across the searing hot sand towards the crashing waves. "Sarah? Sarah?" I heard Mark's voice calling after me, but I couldn't stop, couldn't pull my gaze away from that beloved stuffed animal being mercilessly tossed about. I plunged into the cold Pacific, fighting against the strong current. Just as my fingertips brushed against the bear's matted fur, a powerful swell knocked me off my feet. I gasped for air as my head went underwater, panic setting in. Where was the surface? I thrashed around blindly until finally breaking through again. Spluttering and coughing, that's when I felt a firm grip around my arm, pulling me toward shore with powerful strokes. It was Thomas, his face contorted with concentration and concern. "What the hell were you thinking?" He berated me once we were on dry land, doubled over catching our breath. "You could have gotten yourself killed out there." I clutched Jaden's bear close, shivering from the combined chill of the water and the fear that had set in. For a moment, I had completely forgotten about our conflict, my singular focus being to save that stuffed animal that meant so much to my son. Mark came running over, the rest of the family in tow with worried expressions. As questions began raining down, I saw a tiny figure break free from the group. Jaden. He raced over and embraced me tightly, burying his tear-stained face into the damp fur. In that moment, all the pettiness and envy over airplane seats melted away. What had I become so consumed by this trivial grudge that I had risked everything? My gaze met Thomas's, and I mouthed a silent, "Thank you." He gave a resigned nod, the unspoken acknowledgement of how badly I had lost perspective. But just like that, the fleeting moment passed. "Nice going, Sarah," my sister Bethany chided as the family closed ranks around me. "You're supposed to be watching the kids, not careening into the ocean like a maniac. God, why do you always have to make everything so dramatic?" As her lecture droned on, reproachful eyes boring into me from every direction, I felt that sinking sense of injustice and alienation bubbling up again. My family just didn't get it. They couldn't understand what it was like to sacrifice and scrape for even the simplest shreds of status, only to have it disregarded so callously. And once again, I was the one being painted as the selfish, irrational person. Gripping Jaden's bear tightly, I tuned out my sister's haranguing as options for restoring my tarnished reputation began swirling in my mind. One way or another, I would prove my importance. I would make them see. Over the next few days, I became increasingly withdrawn from the rest of the family. While they spent their time lounging on the beach and sipping fruity cocktails, I plotted. I needed to find a way to reassert my status, to make them realize how invaluable I was. The opportunity arose one evening at an upscale restaurant my dad had made reservations at to celebrate finally being retired. It was the perfect setting, a chance for our whole family to be together in public, surrounded by wealthy patrons who understood the importance of status. As we were being shown to our table, I caught the eye of the hostess and discreetly pulled her aside. "Excuse me, I was wondering if there were any available upgrades to a more premium table?" I asked, trying to keep my voice low. "Perhaps one with a bit more prominence or view." The hostess glanced over at my family, now seated at a perfectly adequate table with a nice view of the ocean. "For just you, ma'am?" she inquired. "I'm afraid all our premier tables are booked for larger parties this evening." I shook my head insistently. No, for my entire family. You see, this is a very special occasion for us, and I'd like to make it an evening to remember. Perhaps something could be arranged." I pressed, pulling out my wallet meaningfully. The hostess looked as if she was going to protest again, but thought better of it after glimpsing the money I was prepared to slip her way. "Let me see what I can do," she replied with a curt nod before disappearing into the back. I returned to the table, feeling reinvigorated. This was it. This was how I would reestablish myself as the undisputed most important person in our family. I could already envision the looks on their faces when the hostess returned to whisk us away to a better table, one befitting our status as her guests of honor. "What did you pull that poor hostess aside for?" Bethany asked with a derisive snicker. "Trying to schmooze an extra breadbasket or something?" I opened my mouth to retort, but was interrupted by the hostess' return with two burly security guards in tow. One of them stepped forward and addressed me sternly. "Ma'am, we've received reports that you are attempting to bribe our staff for special treatment. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises immediately." The table went silent as all eyes turned toward me. A mix of shock and embarrassment etched across their faces. Even Mark looked completely dumbfounded, the usual defending spirit suddenly vacant. But I stammered, utterly trapped. How could this have gone so wrong? This was supposed to be my redemption, not another humiliation. As the security guards took me firmly by the arms, the muffled laughter of nearby diners echoed in my ears. My moment had backfired spectacularly. And this time, there was no salvaging the reputation I had effectively torched beyond repair. The walk of shame out of that restaurant seemed to stretch on for an eternity. The disdainful looks and hushed whispers from the other patrons burned far worse than the security guards' vice-like grips on my arms. As the heavy doors swung shut behind us, shutting out the dim lighting and soft music, I was left alone on the sidewalk, embarrassed, ashamed, and utterly isolated from my family. What had I been thinking, trying to buy our way into elite status like some cheapskate con artist? I considered just leaving, catching the next flight home to Chicago, and avoiding any further public galling. But the thought of my kids, of having to explain why I had abruptly abandoned our family vacation, gave me pause. Could I really run away from this colossal mistake? Staring down at the pavement, I startled slightly as a pair of sandaled feet appeared in my field of vision. I looked up to see Thomas, an unreadable expression on his face. "Quite the scene you caused in there," he said evenly. I opened my mouth to protest, to try and explain myself, but he cutting me off. "Although I can't say I'm entirely surprised, given how you've been acting this whole trip." His words felt like a knife twisting in my gut. Of course, he would see this merely as another extension of my jealousy and entitlement over the airline's seating fiasco. Everyone probably assumed this was just me taking my tantrum to the next level. Tears began welling up, dashing what little remaining dignity I had left. "You don't understand," I croaked out feebly. "You've never had to worry about status or being overlooked because you were born into privilege with your height. I've had to claw for every ounce of respect." To my surprise, Thomas's expression softened slightly as I spoke. Perhaps a glimmer of understanding had finally surfaced behind those judgmental eyes. "You're right, I don't get it," he admitted frankly. "But I also don't get letting that stupid seat situation ruin this whole family trip. Don't you see how petty that looks to all of us?" I swallowed hard, trying to regain my composure. He did have a point. My obsession over restitution for that airplane incident had clearly spiraled out of control into self-destructive pettiness. "You made your choices, and you'll have to live with the consequences," Thomas continued solemnly. "But those kids in there still need their mom. So get it together for them." With that, he turned and headed back towards the restaurant entrance. I lingered for a few moments more, pondering his words and wondering if there was any way to salvage what remained of this vacation from the ashes of my foolish pride. As I stood there on that sidewalk, coming to grips with the magnitude of my mistakes, a part of me still burned with resentment. Years of going unrecognized and unrewarded had manifested into an acute obsession over status that blinded me to what really mattered. My own family had become casualties in my foolish quest for validation. But another part of me, the part Thomas's tough love had reawakened, realized how childish and self-destructive I had allowed myself to become. Was preserving some facade of importance really worth alienating the people I loved most? Losing myself in a way that may never be forgivable? With a heavy sigh, I started making my way back towards the restaurant entrance. As I passed by the windows, I caught glimpses of my family sitting huddled at our table, the celebratory atmosphere now dimmed by my inexcusable scene. Mark's eyes met mine, a pained look of betrayal and disappointment washing over his face before he turned away. Sucking in a deep breath, I pushed through the doors to face the music. I had burned all my bridges here through arrogance and pettiness. There may be no going back, I realized. But if I had even a fleeting chance to make amends with my loved ones, to be a mother worthy of my children's idolization, I had to try. The hostess shot me a venomous look as I approached, clearly not appreciating my return after the prior debacle. A hushed silence fell over the dining room as all eyes tracked my movement toward our table. Pulling out the empty chair beside Mark, I opened my mouth to speak, to attempt to put words to the tangled mess of shame, regret, and hope swirling inside me. But before I could, Lily looked up from her plate with those giant, innocent eyes. "Mommy?" she asked simply, a micro-expression of hurt flashing across her tiny features. In that moment, I felt something shatter inside me, the calcified ego that had encrusted itself around my heart, blinding me to what truly mattered. As the first tears rolled down my cheeks, I reached across and took Lily's hands in mine. "I'm so sorry, baby," I whispered thickly. "Mommy's been acting crazy."